Well, welcome back, everyone, to another episode of the Reformed Catholic Podcast. Today we have a guest with us, my good friend Joshua Johnson. Josh, you want to give a little background of uh, introduce yourself?
Yeah, absolutely. I'm Josh Johnson. I'm currently executive director of Kingdom Workshop outside of Austin, Texas, which is a tech Christian ministry that's also involved in like homesteading and community building. And also the founder of Jesus Village, which is a project to bring Christians together into intentional Christian communities that offers housing for people that are willing to work who may not have a lot of money so they can start families and live a biblical traditional lifestyle. And as it's relevant for this episode, I have extensive experience in apologetics and philosophy. My educational background is largely philosophy and theology, um, and of just that's a lot of my experience in life has been on the front lines fighting atheists and doing that kind of work as I had intended originally to pursue academia before I end up going doing construction instead, and then obviously creating the community project. I have a lovely wife who's due with our 10th child. And it's all very, very exciting. And I'm glad to be here, John.
All right, so today we are going to be looking. I'm not sure if many of you have been following some of my podcast episodes, but the latest one dealing with evolution, we had a lot of atheists responding, those who were in support of evolution and in support of atheism. And today we're going to be dissecting atheism as a system and refuting it. Uh, what do they believe? We know that they don't believe that there's a God, or they claim that they don't believe there's a God, or they're agnostic as to whether there is a God or not. But when it comes down to trying to pin them down to a worldview, it seems that they don't really have one. So today we're going to be looking at what I believe is 3 points that are going to really pin down the atheist worldview. And we're going to break down these 3 points and dissect them and demonstrate why atheism as a system is just illogical nonsense and doesn't make a whole lot of sense. All right, so let's get right into it. Here we go. Refuting atheism. What do they believe? So, our first point is atheists believe that something came from nothing. Now, there's a lot of atheists I know that a lot of atheists in the chat would say, "Oh no, something didn't come from nothing." But if you really boil it down, their system boil it down to uh, where the universe came from. A lot of the atheists that we see out there that believe in evolution are concluding that indeed something came from nothing. Um, and I think we have some quotes here. Okay, well, first we have the Big Bang Theory, that everything that the universe uh, was formed out of a Big Bang. Right there, Big Bang Theory. The Big Bang was the moment 13.8 billion years ago when the universe was a tiny, dense fireball that exploded. I think what's interesting about that is, I think Josh, both of us, we went to public school, and it seems like the number it keeps growing. I think it was 3 billion or 6 billion when I was in public school. I don't know if you can remember that. It seems like it just keeps growing, and it seems like they need to have this so much time so they can have all this time and space for the to explain the Big Bang theory.
Yeah, 100%. Is it all right if I comment on that?
Yeah, go ahead. Yeah, go ahead.
So yeah, like 100%. Actually, recently they've been like scrapping the Big Bang. This is like actually very new with this new telescope that they have that they can claim they can look back in time, which is itself absurd. But yeah, they're actually even reconsidering it, right? This absolute cosmological truth, that is so essential to understanding where we came from, it constantly is changing. I mean, it's the same thing with human evolution, right? Like there was arguments that was millions of years and it's several hundred thousand, and then it jumps back up and it changes from decade to decade. I always like to quip that in the materialistic worldview, like it changes from one decade to another, whether it's good, whether you eat butter or margarine, and they have the audacity to tell us like where we originated from, And I think that when you look at this, and yeah, and I would, and to your point, you brought up how like this concept of time is so important for their model because they have to make enough time for their claims to manifest because the complexity of life that we have, right? You have to have enough time for it to evolve naturally under their own system. And they, in order to have that time, now it began early, right? You could argue it began with the geocentric, heliocentric debate because they needed to explain parallax in the stars. The geocentric and the heliocentric math kind of all math's the same, but it's all a matter of what revolves around what, right? And when it came to stars, the argument was like, well, okay, well, if the Earth is going around the sun, then we would see fluctuations in the appearance of the stars depending on our position in reference to the sun. And of course, the heliocentrists were like, actually, the stars are just so far away. They are the only exception to this concept of parallax. Like they're just so far away, you wouldn't notice any change in how they look, even if you were moving millions of miles in different
So
directions.
they're trying to
And-
use parallax to explain. They're trying to fit their theory into how they see, whether it's heliocentric, how they see the
right.
world, basically.
Right, and it's yeah, and it's ad hoc because without evidence, they make this
Yeah.
assertion in order to save their system. And with Darwinism and things of that nature, it's very similar, right? In order to make up the room that they need, in order for there to be any kind of plausibility to their position, which there's still none, but even if we were to grant them plausibility, they would need an incredible amount of time for simple life to become complex life, for inanimate matter to become animate. Um, and especially with the probabilities being so infinitesimally small, even under their own model, like the amount of time to allow for such a probability to even arise is almost incomprehensible. But yeah, it's very ad
Yeah.
hoc, which is also why it changes
Yeah.
decade to decade. But
Well,
we serve a God who doesn't change.
the fact that time keeps changing, they're like, oh well, it's not of chance. Well, if it's not of chance, then why can't the time stay consistent? Like as Christians, we believe that God created the world in 6 days, and we believe that for 2,000 years. Why can't the time why can't the time stay consistent? It has to keep changing. They have to keep adding years to it. All right.
That's right.
Uh. Okay. Moving on to the next point here. Uh. Can something come from nothing? The old age question, of course, uh, and dealing with the law of cause and effect. That every effect has a specific and predictable cause, and that every cause has an action or a specific and predictable effect. And the Big Bang Theory and evolution along with that uh, seems to defy that, since there is no cause, there is no demonstrable cause for an effect, and uh, so it seems to defy this law.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, there's a phrase that has been used in philosophy that something cannot give what itself does not have, right? Unless you're the Federal Reserve, of course, and you can just print more money. But generally speaking, if I don't have $5, I can't give you $5, right? Because I don't have it, so therefore I can't give it, right? And because nothing is the lack of existence or the lack of something, nothing cannot give something because it can't have something, right? It's not something it can give, right? And this is the cool concept also with matter. Now, obviously, in Newton, you have this concept of the eternality, the sense in which it is self-existent and has always existed. And so that's also been an argument. But where, of course, then the question comes, where did it come from? And only by attributing to inanimate, unperceived matter these attributes, which really belong to God, right? When you think about it, like you're taking inanimate matter and you're giving it divine attributes like eternal, not created or destroyed. Like these sort of things are not definitions that can be given to anything created. And the claim that they are such, first of all, they can't be verified. How would you know that it was uncreated unless you were there? Right? So obviously, right there, it's automatically an inference, And so the whole thing with that whole approach is it's speculative and it's inherently blasphemous because you're attributing to the inanimate things which have always belonged to God. Which is
Uh,
also why atheism ultimately is a religion, because instead of worshiping God,
yeah.
it just worships the natural world.
Yeah, there's a worship of the creator, and I think what's even more disingenuous is they're treating, that which is a theory or which is called a theory in their own world. They're treating it as if it's, this is how things actually happen, when they're just theorizing. They don't really have any idea. I mean, they say, well, Christians, we don't you don't know, where God came from or whatever, and we're going to talk about that and demonstrate how there's actually more logical support for the existence of a God and for a God creating creation. But they are disingenuous and they say, well, science, 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 and they keep pushing this science line when it's just a theory. There's no actual 100% factual evidence to demonstrate that what they are saying about a Big Bang, where the world came from, is true. I think that's
Yeah, 100%.
so disingenuous. So, all right, and then we have right. So we have a couple of quotes here of atheists. This is Alan Guth, and he says the question of the origin of the matter in the universe is no longer thought to be beyond the range of science. Everything can be created from nothing. It is fair to say the universe is the ultimate free lunch. And then we also have a quote from Lawrence Krauss, famous uh, supporter of evolution. And he says, nothing, they insist, is not any of the things I discuss. Nothing they say is non being. In some vague and ill-defined, was it? Ill-defined sense. Some philosophers and many theologians define. The screen's getting cut off for me. Some.
Define
You want
nothing.
you? Yeah, go ahead. You read that.
Yeah, yeah. I'm gonna have to flip perspectives here. Yeah, nothing, they insist, is not any of the things I discuss. Nothing, they say, is non-being in some vague and ill-defined sense. Some philosophers and many theologians define and redefine nothing as not being any of the versions of nothing that scientists currently described. But therein, in my opinion, lies the intellectual bankruptcy of much of theology and some of modern philosophy. For surely nothing is every bit as physical as something, especially if it is to be defined as the absence of something.
And there you go. You
And I,
see this nonsense of calling uh, something like actually treating something or nothing as if it is a kind of something in order to make sense of the Big Bang Theory and of where life came from.
yeah, and I take exception, especially with he's obviously complaining because this is a problem for them. It's a major logical problem for them. And it's not just
No
semantics.
kidding.
Because the thing is, he's like, well, we can describe nothing in a physical way. Okay, I would like you to see you try. Okay, so let's do a thought experiment. Okay, how much does nothing weigh? Right? How big is nothing? How much? What color is it? Like, what's the extension of nothing? The mass? What's the density of nothing? And there's obviously no answers to those things because the nothing is the lack of being. It's non-being. That definition is not of something, right? So if I said the opposite of right is left, that's not vague. That's just the way the words work, right? So when you have the lack of thing, right, a lack of substance, right, you cannot define that with properties, right? So like also in philosophy, right, substance is something that is um, in which properties are used to define, right? So substance is the basis for properties. Properties are descriptors, right? Like
Mm-hmm.
red, mass, measurement, solidity, whatever you want to use.
Sure.
And so you can't predicate nothing because nothing is the absence of being or absence of substance. It cannot have properties. It cannot have attributes that have human description because it is not something.
Is lack of everything.
Nothing could be described in physical terms. It would cease to be nothing.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay, and then we actually have this next quote. You'll find this interesting. But there's disagreement among the atheist ranks, and here's Luke Barnes saying how upset he is at the last guy, what's the guy's name? Krauss.
Lawrence Krauss. Yeah.
Yeah, talking about how something or how nothing is a little bit of something. He says, first and foremost, I'm getting really rather sick of cosmologists talking about universes being created out of nothing. Krauss repeatedly talked about universes coming out of nothing, particles of nothing, different types of nothing, nothing being unstable. This is nonsense. The word nothing is often used loosely. I have nothing in my hand. There's nothing in the fridge, etc. But the proper definition of nothing, not anything. Nothing is not a type of something. It's not a kind of thing. It is the absence of anything. And so this is Luke Barnes, who is a cosmologist in the world of science, but he's also an atheist. And you see his distaste of Krauss, making the argument that nothing is a kind of something, which is kind of interesting. That you think that when you're dealing with atheists that they have this unified front, but when you really dissect it, no. I mean, honestly, there's no unified front across a lot of different beliefs. But you think when it comes to something as simple as the creation of the universe and the definition of nothing, you think that you know among Christians, I think among all religions, nothing is nothing. When it comes to atheists, some atheists believe nothing can be something, and and others believe, well, nothing is nothing. That's quite humorous to me.
Well, and honestly, it's not usually the Christians who will, and obviously this is not like a logical argument against atheism per se, but this is like a little bit of a critique of the approach of atheistic apologists. Because often, especially when you deal with like an argument like Pascal's wager, you'll get arguments from the atheists that'll be like, okay, well, which Christianity, right? You're saying that like based on Pascal's wager that Christianity is the most safe bet, right, for the human being
Yeah,
to choose, and they'll say, well, which Christianity? Well,
yeah,
in the same sense, right, when you were to tell me that physicalism or the naturalistic understanding of cosmology is correct, which school of thought are you referring to, right?
sure,
Because there's many different schools, right? And as me and you talked on the phone last night, we were talking about different theories regarding consciousness within materialistic thinking. And there's type A materialist, type B materialist. There's ones that believe that consciousness supervenes. There's ones that believe that it emerges. Like, and you have this, and a lot of it's also semantics. In the same way they try to redefine nothing, they'll try to redefine consciousness to be something that it can't be, which is the brain. And so when you look at all of this, what you see is like atheism is no less guilty than Christianity of having denominations and divisions.
yeah. Which is something again, just very disingenuous. That, oh no, we believe in science, and science just kind of speaks for itself. It's just kind of this, you know, uh, it's this uh methodology or this fear where the standard where everything is the same and everyone believes the same, but it's just not true. Uh,
Yeah, correct.
all right, we can move on from here. So I believe so. We have the Christian answer to where things came from. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. And of course, that's Genesis 1 1. And then often the question, so we talked about, earlier, we're going to talk about this question that atheists often have. Well, you want to say, well, ask us, badger us on where the Big Bang came from, but where did God come from? Who made God? The stuff like, and so many Christians, they're stumped by this question because they don't properly understand uh the definition of God, or the being of God. And the answer this of course is God is, by definition, is uncreated. Because if, okay, who made God? Well, if you have a God that created a God, then you have to have another God that created that God. Then you have to have another God that created that God. And you have to keep going back and back and back until you actually get to the supreme being who created all of them, who is actually God. Because the very definition of God is that he is uh self-existent, that he is eternal, that he is uncreated, that he has uh being within himself. And so when atheists ask this question, they themselves don't understand the definition of God, because they're trying to worship creation. So they're interacting the world of science. And of course, science can't explain God. Only logic and uh, you know uh, reasoning can explain God, and religion, of course, can explain God. But within their system, all they can understand is, well, you have to have something, can't come from nothing. Yet they contradict themselves.
Yeah, and I would add to that and say a couple things. First of all, how ironic, right? God can be neither created or destroyed, right? They would
Oh yeah,
love to
there
have
you
that
go.
definition
Matter.
for matter. Right, they wanna have that definition for matter, but then they'll deny that definition for God. Um, so no, that won't fly. And then in addition to that, you know, we as Christians presuppose our worldview, right? Like our worldview is spiritually discerned, right? The man of the flesh cannot understand the things of God. He cannot understand the scriptures. He can't
Hmm.
understand these doctrines. But a fundamental part to understand reality, understand who God is something called the doctrine of the aseity of God, right? Or the idea of his absolute independence. For God to be created by another or to have anything else to whom he's dependent or beholden to would make him not the ultimate, not truly
Yeah.
omnipotent because he has dependency, so he has a weakness, right? And likewise, that's also why God is not dependent upon his creatures either for satisfaction, right? In the sense of like, well, people say, well, God needs you to be happy. Well, that's not true because God doesn't need anything from his creatures, right? So the doctrine of the aseity is very important. And by definition, a God that needed to be created is no God at all.
Yeah. It just completely defeats the definition of God himself. All right. So that's the first point. Uh, what atheists believe, that something came from nothing. Now, okay. So yeah, there we go. The final point. This criticism actually disproves the atheist's own position, because, what we just talked about, matter
Yeah,
is uncreated, or
yeah,
matter
that's
has,
right.
yeah, matter cannot be created or destroyed. So, what makes more sense, that a being, a personal being created everything and designed everything, or that everything just kind of happened to come into being?
Right. Without will, without intention, it gives us all our knowledge, but it yet itself has no knowledge, right? How can something with no knowledge give knowledge? How something that is not a mind give thought? How is something that doesn't have uh, passions or emotions, right? How is that able to give it? The problem is just like we were talking about with nothing, something cannot give what it does not have. Nothing doesn't have something, so it can't give it. Similarly, all these things that are placed on matter, right, to be the cause of our sensations, our emotions, our all of that, right? Like matter doesn't have any of those things. So how could it possibly give it? And
Yeah,
we're obviously, when we get into consciousness, we'll get to discuss this a little bit more, but the whole worldview is completely bankrupt. And even when they try to twist definitions, like changing the definition of nothing or changing the definition of consciousness to save their system, right? It ends up being still false. Like even if we let them like violate like logical fallacies, like the fallacy of equivocation, and let them play with definitions, it still doesn't make sense.
yeah, 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 exactly. All right, yeah. So it's funny. It's funny that we mentioned matter, because guess what the next point is, that they believe atheists believe that all reality is material. Now, to be fair, we want to say, I did look this up. I was doing research for this podcast, that not all atheists are materialists, which is quite ironic, because you think they would be, since uh they believe in the Big Bang Theory, or most of them believe in evolution, and they believe in the Big Bang Theory, and they believe in, like, basically matter bringing everything into being from itself. um but we'll get into that. Materialism is the theory that physical matter is the only or fundamental reality, and that all being and processes and phenomena can be explained as manifested results of matter. Uh, and basic, so a simple problem with this is that it cannot explain the existence of logic. Logic, where does logic come from? It exists in the mind. Uh, so it doesn't come from matter. And then also the problem of the mind. The atheist got to say that mind reduces the brain. Uh, okay.
Yeah, no, 100%. And I think like on those particular points, like obviously for logic, a lot of them will try to say that logic is a social convention, right? So that man invented logic, right? But the problem with that is, so before, let's say Aristotle, right? Aristotle is oftentimes attributed as the originator of what we call logic today, like propositional logic, basically the system of logic. Sometimes people even call logic Aristotelian logic, right? To differentiate it from like these weird mystical systems that originated in the East that didn't really focus on deduction.
Sure.
And but the thing is with logic, if that was the case, so before Aristotle, an apple was also a horse. A horse was also an apple, right? Right? Before Aristotle, are we to imply that a man is a rock and a rock is a
Yeah.
man? A man can be a non-man in the
Yeah.
same sense and in the same time. Well,
Sure.
of course, that's absurd, right? So even there, under their own argument, you would have to say that in the same way they would claim that okay, gravity wasn't discovered, but the what happened was we observe, right? But logic itself is not observed, right? Where do you observe A does not equal non-A, right? It's fundamental to all perceptual reality, right? An object is what it is and it's not what it is not, right? And so, but if you don't have any logical laws, right, then that wouldn't apply. So logic can't be a human social convention because obviously everything operated logically before Aristotle. And likewise, logic applies everywhere, even places where humans are not present, right? Are we to suggest that, let's say in the desert in China, right, cactuses are also chocolate cakes, and chocolate cakes are also cactuses at the same time, the same instance, just because
Yeah.
a human did not apply that social convention there? Well, of course
Yeah.
not. Logic are
Yeah.
universals. They're laws that are necessary for language, for reality, for everything to exist. And because they're universal, they're not particular. So they can't be made up of particular like atoms that are spatially like extended, right? They're
Yeah.
extended in space. They're
Because it's
objects
not
that have a
evolving.
limit,
It's not
right?
evolving. It's always been the way it is, and you can't say that it's going to change or that it's going to get better because it can't. It just if you try to change it, then the nature of reality doesn't make any sense and thinking starts to fall apart.
Right. How could non-logic evolve to logic, right? So, like, if you're saying that logic evolved in humans when they evolved from like Cro-Magnons or Neanderthals, well, if logic wasn't evolved in a Neanderthal, does that mean that the Neanderthal thought his spear was his rock, and his rock was his spear, and they were
Yeah.
indifferentiable, right?
Yeah.
That's absurd. That's absurd on its
Yeah.
face.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. So as we said earlier, as we just commented on, not all materialists are not all materialists believe in materialism, and we were talking about this last night a little bit. David Chalmers and his argument against materialism using his 2D argument against materialism, which is pretty interesting. Now, Chalmers I believe he is an atheist. He doesn't believe in God, but still, he's arguing against materialism, which seems to me to be an argument against evolution. And his argument is basically, and you can, explain this better, but I can just kind of give my common perception of his argument. His argument is basically that because we can conceive of a world where zombies exist and they don't have, they're not able to think, this defeats materialism because the idea that the materialist idea that the mind is just comes from the material brain. Well, if we can conceive of a world where zombies exist, well, they have a material brain, but they don't have a mind. That means that materialism can't be true. Oh, can't hear you. Uh-oh, can't hear you. Okay.
All right, can you hear me now?
Yeah. Go ahead.
So I was gonna say that the problem with the 2D argument, and it's not necessarily a problem, it's like it's a super because it's an analytic philosophy. So for most people, it's like it would like they would go to read it, right? If we linked it, and they'd be
Yeah.
like, "What in the hell is this? Like
Sure.
this seems like gobbledygook. Like P doesn't equal Q when such applies, and
Yeah.
this applies to supervenience, right?
Well,
Like what's
the
supervenience,
more
right?
detailed, logical language. Yes, the one. Yeah.
Yeah, two schools of thought within materialism. Well, there's multiple schools of thought and how to address consciousness. And it really began with what was called the explanatory gap, which there's been philosophers that had like obviously understood this before that you can't reduce the mind to matter. Descartes obviously believed that. A lot
Yeah.
of the early philosophers believed that. But something happened in like England and America and other countries where materialism and the scientific establishment worldview basically became so ubiquitous and everywhere that all of philosophy basically was hijacked by materialists. And so materialists just doing logic and studying philosophy eventually end up coming back to the same dilemma that was discussed thousands of years ago, which is that it's impossible really to reduce consciousness directly to the brain. So the explanatory gap kind of emerged. I mean, there's multiple arguments that exposed it, but one that exposed it was the Mary in the color scientist. And so Mary and the color scientist, you have a woman, she's born blonde, she's born with like with black and white vision. She's only or whatever, like only ever seen black and white. She's in a black and white room, black and white monitors, and she's trying to study redness.
Mm,
So she tries to describe redness in terms of physical properties, right? Like wavelength of light, right? What is red? Red is on the wavelength of light spectrum between so and so. She got testimonials, people like trying to describe what redness was like from their experience. So she studies that on her monitor. She also looks at the synapses that fire in the brain when people said that they were experiencing redness. And based on this scientific materialistic worldview, by just analyzing the properties, right, the physical properties relating to the experience of redness, under that worldview, that should be sufficient. So if you understand that the synapses firing the brain, you understand the brain chemistry, you understand the wavelength of light, then you have a perfect knowledge of redness under their worldview. But then that woman, that color scientist Mary, she leaves that room for the first time in her life and she sees a red rose. Does she know something different that she didn't know before? Right? And the argument is absolutely. And we all know that
yeah.
intuitively, right? And also, I use another similar argument, that's actually pretty common, just like regular working class people have used this argument just for talking, which is that, okay, can you describe redness to someone who was born blind? You would have to try to reference other sensations and experience and other properties. You can explain to that person synapses in the brain. You can explain to them wavelengths of light. But a person who's born blind cannot understand redness, nor would your explanations be able to generate that experience. What this demonstrated, this explanatory gap, was that the experience of an individual in his mind, his experience of things, his awareness or his consciousness, cannot be explained in terms of physical properties like the brain or like light or like the physical world. And therefore, consciousness or the experience of things like redness or sweetness or whatever, or love or beauty, right? Those things cannot be reduced to the physical. Now, this was obviously a huge like crisis among the materialists who had hijacked philosophy, like I was just talking
Mm,
about.
yeah.
And but so how did they try to deal with that, right? Well, you had different schools of materialism have to like reemerge in order to try to figure this out because like they're in crisis. This brings their
Oh
whole
no.
worldview into suspicion. Daniel Dennett, as an example, he was one of the four, like they were called the four horsemen of the apocalypse. They were the four atheists of the new atheist movement, like Christopher Hitchens, Richard Dawkins, and there was Daniel Dennett. And Daniel Dennett was also Sam Harris. But Daniel Dennett was a philosopher of mind, right? So he was dealing with this very argument. And he argued that, well, Mary didn't learn anything different because sensations are just illusions, right? At the end of the day, physical description is all that really matters. You don't really taste milk, right? He would argue. You're not really experiencing anything. You're just a
Wow.
brain.
That just
You're
sounds like
just
a
a
bunch of
brain doing things.
nonsense.
Right. So they had to reduce, he reduced it to an illusion. All the things that you experience in life, all the sensations you experience, all the pleasures, all the joys, they're illusory, they're illusion. The only thing that's actually real is an empirical description of an object. Though the problem with that is that what is an empirical description, right? Like if I were to describe my table, I would describe that it's hard, it's brown, right? All these
Yeah.
different things, right? Well, just like with Mary, the color scientist, brownness is something that can't be reduced to physical description. And all of those descriptions I just gave of the table suffer from that same problem. They can be reduced to that first person perspective that can reduce no further. You can't go further than that. So the problem is like even that argument doesn't even make any sense. So what David Chalmers is responding to here is he's basically like, okay, so there's a school of thought of materialism that argues that the brain is like the hardware, right? Like a computer. This is how they try to get around it, right? And consciousness or the soul, right? They wouldn't use that word obviously, but because that would mean they might have some accountability in the life to come, which
Sure.
that's the whole reason they're atheists. They don't want that, so they can live their degenerate lifestyle, blowing each other or whatever they do, right? And because they don't want that accountability, they want to deny the basically the eternality of the soul. They don't want to believe in that because that would make them have to question their life choices, right? As atheists, right? So in reality, right? So how do they answer this, right? They're like, well, let's use an analogy. The brain is like the hardware, right? We have hardware and we have software, right? So you have hardware in your computer, and then when the hardware is running, right, and it's working, it's all in the right places, all the components are there, the microchip, then you have something appear on your screen, you have these programs, and that is the software. So consciousness or the soul is the software, and the brain is the hardware. And therefore, we can deny that the soul is eternal because once the hardware is broken, the software no longer exists,
So
right?
the soul basically is formed out of the brain, out of the physical,
Right. And that's called emergentism, the idea that consciousness emerges when the right physical conditions are present,
which is like
right?
nonsense.
Acknowledging,
That's never how has that ever been demonstrated like in real life at
right.
all ever.
Well, there's also it, and actually it runs right headlong into Rene Descartes' issue, right? Because one of the objections that I believe it was either Catherine or Elizabeth of Bohemia, it was the princess that Descartes was tutoring. She actually brought up this objection to Descartes because he was what's called a mind-body dualist. So he wanted to
Yeah.
maintain that there's a material physical body, and in the pineal gland there exists a soul, right? And she brought up like,
Yeah.
well, if the body's material extended in space and the soul is immaterial and not extended, how can a soul be located in one individual person and not everybody all at once? Because if it's immaterial and it's not extended, that means it would occupy all space simultaneously and not just one individual body. And Descartes famously had no real answer to that, right? And but the thing is this argument that these emergentists are using falls under the same criticism because if consciousness, because of the explanatory gap, is irreducible and not material, it's not subject to material description. How can it emerge from the material, right? How can something non-material emerge from the material? Just like how can something come from nothing? It's the same issue, really.
Yeah.
Matter cannot give what it does not have. Matter cannot
Uh,
give knowledge. It can't give experience because it has none.
that's like
So
saying if you
obviously,
put all the organs, the right organs together, you can create life.
right,
But it just that it's never happened. They've tried to do it. They've been
right,
trying to do it. You can't create life.
right. And it's like American is actually really good. I think it's the guy's name is E. Michael Jones. I think he wrote a book called Monsters of the Id, which analyzed like horror fiction. And he argued that a lot of horror fiction comes from or originates from like immoral guilt or like false worldviews, and then it's manifested in fiction with the monster that represents like their own guilt. There's a lot of like stuff in it, like psychology, that I'm not necessarily on board with, but he's a Catholic guy and he's pretty solid. But one of the things that he actually says with Frankenstein is that Mary Shelley, and if you look at her history and her where she came from and her family, like her mother was like one of the first feminist writers period ever, and she herself was like a
Yeah.
total degenerate, like revolutionary
Oh, yeah,
left-wing
really bad.
psycho.
Yeah.
And Frankenstein really is, in some ways, an allegory of the end goal, so to speak, of materialism. And the way that is like
Mm,
what did Frankenstein try to do, right? Dr. Frankenstein. He tried to take a dead bodies, right, in parts, and make it come to life, like have life in it, right? He's like, all the biological parts are there, all the organs are in the right place. So zap it with some lightning, do a few little tweaks, and boom, it'll live again. But that's not true. But Mary Shelley was prescient to show that that monster is something that man is going to try to create. That is the logical end of materialism. Just like the transhumanist movement wants to be able to upload your consciousness into like the cloud, right? Just like they want to like replace organs with, silicone parts and put a neurochip in your brain, right? In order that you might live forever. They even say that we're going to cure death, but you're not going to cure death because the wages of sin is death, right? We know this. We've all
right.
known this. It's the inescapable reality. It's not a disease that can be cured. It's a judgment that cannot be avoided.
Yeah.
And as long as and if you understand that rightly, you see the folly in their worldview from the perspective of our worldview, which is the foundation of all Western thought and civilization. And so when it comes to this whole like the Frankenstein monster, it just symbolizes what they're always going to try to do. They want to be God because in their world they are God because they worship the self.
And
And
so is
go ahead.
Chalmers' response is basically the fact that we can even conceive of, and we even have them. We even have to think about zombies, but when we look at people that are in, these states where they can't express themselves, we have people that are in a zombie state, uh, even today in our world. And so we look at this people and we say, we can't, you know, we say the fact that they are even exist demonstrates that materialism isn't true because you know they they uh uh they just the fact that materialism can't explain the fact that, well, everything in their body seems to be functioning properly, but they can't think logically, they can't express a thought.
Right. And yeah, and actually that's good. That's a good segue because I wanted to kind of return to Chalmers just for a moment.
Yeah.
And so his argument's called a conceivability argument. So he's demonstrating materialism's claim is false. This particular branch, right? The one that says consciousness necessarily emerges from the hardware of the brain being in the right proportions and having the right chemistry. And the way he refutes it, though, is by attacking a distinction they tried to make, a semantic one, like, kind of like how they try to redefine nothing, that they can
Yeah.
just somehow describe it physically. They try to do the same thing with consciousness. They're like, okay, consciousness, because of the explanatory gap, we can't reduce it, right? So here's how we're going to get around this issue, right? And still be materialist, because if it's not reducible material consciousness, then materialism is false, because materialism is claiming that everything is material, right? So if consciousness exists and cannot be materially reduced, then materialism is refuted, right? So how do they explain this consciousness as software emerging from material brain still being material, right? This software still has to be material. Technically, under their position, the software still has to be hardware, right? So how do they get around it? This is how they did it. They said, well, okay, only in an epistemological sense, only in terms of how we conceive of it. But in reality, metaphysically, it's actually material. Like, we can't know that it's material, but it must be, right? Under their worldview, right? They're assuming that.
Yeah,
They're assuming what has to be proven,
because we
right?
always
That'd
we
be an
always say it
easier.
came from a god. Yeah.
Right. But see, it's funny is that use of words, that's switching it, where it's saying like, okay, yeah, consciousness is not material epistemologically, but metaphysically it's still material. This is what Chalmers is refuting, and he's doing it by
Okay.
attacking how they're using the words. And how he demonstrates it is with that zombie world argument. So what he says is, can you imagine a world, right, where all the human population has all their organs,
Um,
their brains, right? They don't experience redness, they don't experience joy. They're just animate bodies moving around doing things, but they have no thought, right? Kind of like a robot, you might say, right? If we now here's this is where it gets interesting. He's saying if we can conceive of that, right? If it's conceivable, right, then it's at least possible, right? A conceivable possibility is a metaphysical possibility, right? So if it's logically conceivable, like for instance, you can't conceive of something of a world where A does not equal non-A, right? Because by definition, then it would be you can't even think of it, right? You can't imagine a world where a man is everything and everything is also nothing, right? That wouldn't make any sense,
sure.
right? Because it's illogical, right? So that's not a possible world because it's not a conceivable world, right? But the idea of there being humans that don't have any inner thoughts but are just moving around, right, like zombies, that is conceivable. You can imagine it, right? But that's his point. He says if it's imaginable and it's genuinely possible that there could be such a place, right? Then that means that there is possible that there could be a duplicate world where there's people that don't have any consciousness, right? But if that's true, then consciousness cannot be 100% explained or guaranteed just by the physical hardware of the brain. Because if it was logically impossible to separate consciousness from the brain, then we wouldn't be able to conceive of people that have a brain without consciousness. That's his point. He's saying that their word game, it doesn't make any sense. If they're saying that consciousness like must come from the brain, always come from the brain, and wherever the brain is functioning, there will always be consciousness. If that was the case, then it would be just as irrational to try to imagine a world where there was people with brains but no inner experiences as it would be to try to imagine a world where everything was nothing and nothing was everything and man was everything at the same time. It's just as irrational. So if that's the case, as these atheists try to run like rats to come up with new excuses to try to like make their worldview make sense, this last one that they did was to like do one last word game. They got their asses kicked literally on every field of battle. So they try to play this game by switching the words. Like we're not really saying this, and Chalmers annihilates it. There
This
is no longer anywhere they can hide.
this demonstrates how illogical of a system it is, and I mean, I guess all they can do at the end of the day is say, "Well, it's science. We believe science." But it's like,
You know, what's funny is they should just do what they want, like what some people do, right? They should. It's just a mystery, man. Right? It's just a mystery. We can't know.
at what point, just become at what point are they even redefining, what science is? That's
Well,
a
no, of course,
you
of course, right, right. And the thing is like, look, I don't have enough faith to be an atheist.
yeah. Exactly. It's so
There's
yeah,
too much mystery.
doesn't
There's
make
too much
sense.
mystery.
All right, so the last point that we want to look at here, and we can close on this one is atheists believe in moral subjectivity. So atheists may claim no difference between right and wrong, but uh, they can only appeal to their own opinions and their ideas of morality without an objective standard of morality to point to. Atheists are forced to rely on definitions of morality such as the harm principle. And when they do define right and wrong properly, they are borrowing from the Christian worldview, which does hold to an objective right and wrong, because we believe that right and wrong comes from God, who is absolute. And only belief in God can lead to objective morality and absolutes. And could probably talk about this one for quite some time. But like for instance, when atheists try to, even when they try to form some kind of objective morality relying on the harm principle, you know, uh, the fact when they try to form this harm principle and they say, well, this is our objective standard that you can't do harm to anyone. Even it demonstrates right within itself that that very principle relies on the person's subjective experience. Because what harm is to one person may not be harm to to another person. And of course, they would appeal to cultural consensus and what culture says, harms a person or doesn't harm a person. But as we've seen over the past 100 years in our culture, the idea of harm and what is cultural consensus of right and wrong is continually changing. Back in the 60s or 50s, I think even as late as maybe the 70s or 80s, homosexuality was seen as in the world of medicine, it was seen, if you were homosexual, it was seen as a mental illness in the world of psychology. Not saying that psychology is correct, but the fact that they define homosexuality as a mental illness demonstrates the kind of worldview that they were operating under, or at least the kind of worldview that the majority of people held to at that time. And where now we see, transgenderism, and it's okay to cut off your private parts and to replace them, and to, you know, basically call yourself whatever sex or gender you want. So really, at the end of the day, the harm principle uh doesn't make sense because it relies upon the person's own subjective opinion and own subjective morality. I lost you for a
Yeah,
sec there.
no,
Okay.
100%. No, I turned off my video for a second.
Okay.
What I was so on regarding the moral, like, so we're talking about to some degree the moral argument, right?
Yeah.
It's had many people that have kind of proposed it. There's debate about who really articulated it first. Obviously, C.S. Lewis is known for using it. And really, when it comes to the moral argument, and actually, I would argue presuppositionalists probably nailed it the best. But reality, without presupposing the Christian worldview and the moral law as given by
Correct.
God, right, as well, along with final judgment and all of that goes with that, without that,
Yeah.
right, you cannot justify the universal reality of morality. As an example, one of the things about morality that's pretty much it's more or less universally believed, by almost every culture everywhere, is that there are certain things that are always right and always wrong, right? Like it is never right to torture innocent children for pleasure, right? In any culture, in any place, even if everybody in that culture believed it, the idea that we all assume and believe a universal moral law code. Now, obviously, there are some evolutionists who have a Darwinian explanation for the origins of religion and morality, and I can get into that if you want in a little bit. But for now, I would say that, especially when it comes to the harm principle, there's multiple atheistic approaches to ethics. I would say the two most popular are utilitarianism and egoism. So they both kind of operate on the harm principle in different ways, but utilitarianism specifically is most famously known for using that harm principle.
Sure.
And if we're all just animals, right, and there is no God and there is no universal morality, then how would you get a morality that could create a functioning society? So for the atheistic worldview, the way that they do that is what they say is like, okay, well, we make no truth in it. People tend to pursue pleasure, right? They'll say, okay, if this thing really hurts, I avoid it. If it causes harm to others, I avoid it because I empathize with the pain that they also have. And I make a decision based on what's pleasurable. And they'll say, well, if that's so, you might object and say, okay, but yeah, but then the dentist hurts and it sucks. And so because that's not pleasurable, I would never go to the dentist. Right. Now they would have nuance to that and they would reply, well, actually, it's about weighing the pleasure and pain, right? So they would say the pain of getting that bad tooth removed outweighs, right, the lack of pleasure at that moment because it's saving me from an extended amount of suffering from the infection, so on and so forth, right? And so that's their general conception. So when you add this to the collective scale, to like society by large, right? Society writ large, right? When they apply that principle, they do it based on majority consensus, right? Not even full consensus, just majority, right? So the maximal amount of pleasure for the maximal amount of people. That is the right. So, and they would, but the problem with that, right, is that it undermines the whole concept of objective morality in multiple ways. For one, right? you could then conceive a society where the torturing of innocent children for pleasure could exist and it'd be morally virtuous under utilitarianism. As an example, we actually have not quite the same thing, but still pretty bad, which is like in ancient Greece, pagan society. And there was a lot of pederasty with children. So sexual molestation, especially homosexual sexual molestation of children. And even there, you can't say it was non-consensual because the kids were, preteen. They kind of knew what was going on, and their parents agreed to the arrangement. Oftentimes, you had poor men. They had sons they wanted to be tutored to maybe be able to participate in the polis, right? To be able to vote and to debate with the other men. They needed training, intellectual training, philosophical training. And so what they would do is they would hire a tutor, typically a philosopher, a Platonist, an Aristotelian, a Stoic, an Epicurean, regardless, right? And oftentimes it was just assumed that that male tutor was going to have sex with the young boy student. There was Greeks that used to say that um, women are for children and boys are for pleasure, right? And but you understand, like that was you can make the argument, well, that's fine. That was their society. That was okay,
Sure.
and they agreed to butt raped and having to suck an old man's dick, right? That does not outweigh the pleasure he received in life by being a famous senator when he was older, right? So why not? Why not have child molestation? If it was regulated, right, and everybody was down for it, why not? Right? What if everybody enjoyed having sex with dead bodies? Why not? You recently tripped up an atheist on this very issue. Technically, under their own argument, if the dead body's not experiencing any pain and you're getting nothing but pleasure, that's actually one of the most moral things you could ever do under that argument, right?
Exactly.
Because no one suffers anything under that. So actually, one of the most virtuous things you can do in atheist morality is have sex with dead bodies, like your dead grandma. Like that would be wonderful under their view. Why not? Right? And so, but this is the consequences. And real-time consequences, like these are fantastic examples, but there's also real-life consequences because societies that often hold to the harm principle are socialists. So most like historic socialists applied utilitarianism, like rob from a ton of society, right? Take their material possessions, take their businesses, take their property, and redistribute it. Because they would argue the suffering of the few wealthier people or the few productive people, right, does not outweigh the pleasure all these other people are going to get from receiving those goods once they redistributed,
I was gonna say by
right?
that
And how
same
they
arg
enforce it,
I would say by that
right?
same argumentation, you could argue, well, we should, our in our hospitals, we should emphasize our care for the young and for those who are and for the children over the old and those who are dying because you know uh if we spend more time focusing on those who are elderly and those who are sick, well, it's actually harming the culture. So you can take it that far, if we're talking about harm principle, you're not just harming individual, but harming the whole culture, harming the whole society. Uh, you could argue that, well, we should spend, and what's actually see kind of going on in our country right now is that, hospitals are giving more preferential treatment to those who are younger and to those who are children over those who are elderly and those who are ill.
Yeah, and I would also like to also go back to the real world ramifications. This is how socialist countries could justify persecuting minorities, killing religious groups, right? Because they're saying, well, they're
Yeah.
hurting the revolutionary progress of the society. Their deaths, torture, death, murder, is justifiable because by eliminating them, the larger group will benefit with greater pleasure as they're able to more fully implement socialism. Operated on some harm principle utilitarian ethic. The other ethic that's also common is egoism, because I mentioned there was two. Now, egoism is like more common among like libertarian thinkers. Like Ayn Rand is also an atheist, but she's not a socialist. She's a libertarian. Well, she hated the term libertarian, but basically that's what they are: free markets, minimal government, things of that sort. And the way that she justified her ethic as an atheist was saying that um, basically every person operates within their own self-interest, right? So she would say that we as rational animals operate in the self-interest of ourselves for survival, right? Of selfishness. because she argued that people being selfish is actually virtuous because that what drives them in their market forces, right? A man works to support himself and to support his family, and that's inherently selfish because he's thinking about himself and his own kindred, but that makes him a productive member of society engaging in free trade, right? In some ways, like as a Christian, especially one that grew up in the United States where we value liberty, that approach seems more appealing to us oftentimes than the atheistic approach. But she also used this to justify abortion. She didn't like homosexuality, but she had a hard time denying it. She was just kind of like older and more old fashioned. She didn't really have an ethical objection to it, right? An actual ethical objection, other than it was unnatural. But that
Yeah.
doesn't really mean anything under your worldview because animals butt rape each other all the time, right? So, and if we're just animals, then why not? Like we already brought up about like she actually kind of loved Aristotle. She viewed herself as like a new Aristotle, like, but that's the kind of thing the men in that culture were into. So, like, who are you to say? And was he acting in his self-interest? Yeah, sure. It could be my self-interest to engage in homosexual acts with children because I could make money from the person who's paying me to tutor his child. And he's like, I'm cool with you banging him. So why not? Right. And there's all sorts of evil acts that we could justify as self interest. Now, she would try to claim to say that evil acts aren't in a person's self interest because they come with ramifications. Right. And so, but the thing is that people don't always make decisions if they're making decisions on their self-interest, right? Then really what ends up happening is they're going to try to do those evil things and get away with it. See, the difference is, yeah, there's ramifications if you don't get away with it, right? So yeah, if you're selfish and you're only doing things your self-interest, yeah, it would normally be a bad idea to steal because you'll go to jail. But if you could get away with it, right, then why not? Right? And in reality, especially if you combine that with Darwinism, you could actually argue that I'm just a superior human being because I got away with
But
it. I'm more highly evolved.
so by that, so this is called egoism, you're saying? So by that reason, you
Yes.
could, it's okay to kill people and steal from them if I can get away with it? Like,
She would say, yeah, I mean, they would try to deny that. They would say it's still an immoral act to attempt it because of the potential ramifications of getting caught, or if you tried to murder somebody, his family retaliated, things like that. But at the end of the day, the only question that needs to be asked of them is would it still be immoral if you knew for a fact that you would get away with it? And
yeah,
there is no answer to that because at the end of the day, there
yeah.
is no God above, there
That's
is no
how
hell below,
socialist. That's how socialist states function. You have the strong preying on the weak.
right?
Every socialist state that we've seen, it's only like the fact that these people want to live in. I mean, yes, our moral fabric in our country has been decaying over the past 100 years or 50 years, but it's still better than the French Revolution where they were basically clawing at each other and eating each other for lunch and breakfast. Uh, and every day, the next leader, the leader that had just been the guy that just been leading the country the next day, he was put on the guillotine on the chopping block. like so uh it just demonstrates when you look at I think that's a really good way to look at it is by looking at nations and the ideologies of nations. And we look at the United States of America, for the most part, were formed on Christian principles and Christian objective morality, and that was what has made this nation great and set itself apart from other nations. I mean, look at also like nations like Great Britain. And when Great Britain was at its height, it was also, they also held to objective morality. And of course, they've fallen far from that recently. But, I think it's not uh, outside of the realm of reason to say that the reason that these countries are failing and the reasons that the countries aren't doing well is because they have departed from an objective standard, and they have moved towards the harm principle and this ego principle and these atheist ways of explaining morality. Because at the end of the day, like I said at the beginning, at the end of the day, all amounts to the subjective person. Like, if I can get away with it, if I'm not harming you, and if you're okay with it, then we can do whatever we want to do. We can do whatever the hell we want. like,
Yeah, 100%. I couldn't
and
agree more, brother.
doesn't make so these three things like really defeat atheism. And Uh, I'm reminded of Stephen Charnock, who's a Puritan theologian, and describing he's basically living in the 1600s, and describing how in his time, atheism as an ideology is basically banished in England because it seemed to be so ridiculous. Uh,
100%.
because logically, and it seemed to be so ridiculous, and just on a day in day out basis when you deal with the world, you know it just seemed to be absolute nonsense. And I think looking at these three things is really helpful for uh not just us, but the viewers, just to be reminded, for our Christian viewers, and maybe for our atheist viewers, to kind of have a wake up call to realize, you know, what your worldview is that you hold to, and the fact that the faith that is required of you to believe these things and to believe this other nonsense, but to be reminded, as we are Christians, that the foundation that we can have in believing that in believing in a triune God who's created all things and who has given us His word and sent His Son to die for us. Uh, that we can have a sure foundation standard to live by, day in and day out. And Josh, did you have anything else you want to say before we close out?
Yeah, I would like to just, I guess, kind of let atheists know one of the things, because one of the things, though, there are some atheists who are going to say that religion and morality evolved. And it's interesting that, so there's actually an evolutionary anthropologist named Satoshi Kanazawa, a Japanese guy. And he had a book called The Intelligent Choice Isn't Always the Smart One, called The Intelligence Paradox.
Mm-hmm.
And he argues that, you have like people with high IQs per se, right? A lot of times they're more likely to be atheists, secular, though the person with the highest IQ in the world is a Christian from Korea, by the way. So the smartest man on earth is a Christian.
Fascinating.
Yeah. But typically, right, people that tend to be more high IQ tend to be people that stay up really late, get up late, party, engage in weird sexual deviancies, be academic secularists, things of that sort, right? And Satoshi, that would be evolutionary novel to human beings. Because what if human beings are evolved primates, like we actually more likely to survive and thrive by not having that high IQ approach, but doing things that we would call common sense or smart as he's using it. So in a sense, like going to bed early, getting up early to rise, right? You're asleep when the sun is down, right? This applies to like our circadian rhythm and just basic health,
Sure.
right? Likewise, you will reproduce. So you would be heterosexual, you would find a mate, and you would reproduce of the fittest. At the end of the day, what really matters in terms of natural selection is human reproduction, right? So, given natural selection in the way that Darwin described it, if there was a sin in Darwinian materialism, it would be not reproducing, because the random mutations, right, that are then selected, right, through this natural selection process, right, they can only propagate if that generation reproduces and continues the chain on. But in reality, what he found was the people that actually most reproduce among humans tend to be people that go to bed early, get up early, are religious, right? Often Christian, have big families, have babies, are heterosexual and patriarchal, right? But here's the interesting thing then, with the evolutionary worldview, Christians, especially traditional conservative Christians, just given our birth rate and the way that we live, are the most highly evolved humans on earth. We are peak evolution. We are superior beings under their worldview. So if atheism is true, then Christians are superior to atheists, because atheists don't really breed that much. They don't. And if you look at birth rates and all sorts of metrics, like if you're an atheist or a secularist, statistically, your sex life is far worse. You have far less sex, far less enjoyable sex. You also don't have babies. You don't have children. Your birth rate is crap. So if we're talking about human as an evolved primate, a collective primate, right? As primates, if we wanted to guarantee our own survival as a species and our evolution, we would kill all the atheists because they're a liability. They're a genetic dead end. They're a danger to our survival under their own argument. So, really, if evolution is true, we have an obligation not to believe it. Because if we believe in evolution, right, then we'll stop breeding and then our evolution would cease. So if evolution is true, we are obligated not to believe it. So if evolution is true, you're obligated to be a Christian. And if Christianity is true, evolution is false. So no matter how you cut the cake, even if we gave the evolutionists everything, their entire worldview, they would still be obligated to be a Christian if they wanted to be a surviving human that propagates.
Yeah.
So I just want to remind atheists of that. If evolution is true, you're obligated to be a Christian.
Yeah, that's great words to end the podcast on, for sure. But we hope you enjoyed this podcast refuting atheism. This episode refuting atheism. If you haven't yet, please subscribe and leave a like. It helps to get the message out and uh, you know the video out and the algorithm out to people that really need to see this video. Atheists that probably need to wake up and smell the roses and see that their worldview isn't as as ironclad as they think it is. Um,
100%. 100%. Ladies, hey, men and women out there, don't be atheists because it will hurt your sex life. You will have less sex. You'll have less enjoyment and you won't have babies and you'll be alone with your cat. So,
yeah.
really, at the end of the day, young people out there, listen, man, if you just want to have no sex and be miserable, embrace atheism and evolution. Go ahead.
Exactly. On that note, uh, just keep in mind we have a couple videos that are gonna be coming out soon. Another video on baptism, another video pagan and liberalism in the church, and we're gonna be looking at psychology, uh, quite ironically. Uh, so keep a lookout for those videos, and until next time, may God keep you in the one true faith.
Amen, guys. God bless.